This video series could very well be one of the most important things you ever watch. And believe me, it's not because I'm making the videos, it's because of what you're going to learn in the videos. It's the information in the videos. If you're a believer, your faith will grow stronger and it will soar to heights you never imagined. If you're an agnostic or even a full-blown atheist, I'm fairly confident that you will either consider the possibility of a God or maybe even join us in the theist camp. I will count it a victory if I can get an atheist to at least stop looking down their nose at believers like we're out of our minds. Just at least consider the possibility in a creator, and I will consider that a win. So let me tell you what we're going to talk about in this series of videos. First of all, it makes sense, right, that if we're going to talk about God, we need to first talk about proof of his existence. So we'll first lay that foundation by using science and philosophy. We're going to look at cells, DNA, quantum mechanics, and other scientific evidences. We'll talk about philosophical arguments for God's existence as well. Of course, there is no way to prove 100% that God is real, because that would require me showing you God. I'd have to say, okay, here he is, look at him right here. But if juries can convict people of crimes based on evidence, and they didn't have to be there to actually see the crime, they can piece it all together based on the evidence in the room. If people can be convicted that way, then surely we can use the same brain power to piece together the evidence that we find in our universe for a creator. You know, God did leave a lot of clues for us to find him. So we're going to look at these clues and see if we can come up with a verdict. After we establish the evidence for God's existence, we're then going to move into the study of God, or theology proper, which is the doctrine of God. This is the highest pursuit of knowledge anybody can take. There is nothing the human creature can think about or study that will require more of your brain power than studying God. But it's also so fulfilling and intellectually satisfying to stretch the brain to try to comprehend divinity. We're never going to understand God, but it is fulfilling to try to understand God. So we're going to look at who or what God is. Is God spirit, mind, information? Is God a tree, a force? We will then study the attributes of God, such as his holiness and his grace, love, wrath, the Trinity, and so forth. These videos are not just about information. I don't want you to just know about God. You can find plenty on the internet about God. But after we establish the fact that he's real, and then we study what he's like, then we're going to move into the final videos about how to get to know this God. We'll talk about prayer, spiritual disciplines like worship and meditation, and these disciplines that help you draw near to God and cultivate a deeper relationship with God. So if you've ever been curious about how we can know if God exists, if you've ever wondered who or what God is, or if you've ever wondered if you can even know God personally, stick around and watch these videos, and I promise you, you will never be the same. All right, so let's get into the evidence for God's existence. We're first going to start with evidence from cells. You know, there are many scientific evidences for God's existence, and we're going to talk about a lot of them. But nothing is more convincing than studying cells, DNA, and the origin of life. We're going to talk a lot about science, but I wanted to go for the jugular right out the gate. There just simply isn't stronger evidence for God's existence than what we're going to talk about. This isn't something that atheists can casually brush off and ignore. The evidence is very compelling. Now, life, to the creationist, is even more complex than matter and energy, because life emerges from matter and energy. It's one thing to have an atom or a molecule, or even a collection of atoms that form the human body. But when that collection of atoms begins to move around and think and ask questions about where it came from, you're at a whole other level. See, for that collection of atoms to move around and think and ponder their own existence, instructional information has to be added to the mix, or the atoms just keep being atoms. Not that atoms are simple and unimportant. Atoms are extremely fascinating inventions of our Creator. But atoms just by themselves with no information added won't do anything. And the question you have to ask is, where did the information come from that must have preceded matter and energy to give rise to the first life? How did life emerge from non-living atoms and molecules? How did inanimate matter come together in just the right way and then have the ability to think about itself? Did chance and time really give rise to complex biological machines that are far superior to anything humans have ever been able to make? I just don't think so. And I think by the time we're done with this video, you'll agree with me. You see, it's not enough to just ask how you get new life forms from pre-existing life forms, or how more complex life forms evolve from simpler life forms. It's not a very good argument to think that anything could evolve from simpler life forms, because nothing gets simple at the cellular level, or the atomic level, or even the quantum level. You can go back in time until you get to the first cell, and you really just opened Pandora's box. You can probe even deeper until you get to the proteins, and even here you run into miraculous machines that are anything but simple. So to really understand where life came from originally, we can't start with humans and work our way back to simpler life forms, because these simpler life forms are not simple. They're incredibly complex because of what they're made out of. We need to start with cells and the parts that make cells live and operate. When you start at the tiniest of scales, you begin to see that nothing is simple. And if we're honest with ourselves, it shows evidence of design. You know, every time I talk to an atheist about this, they always stop short of asking, where did life come from to begin with? Where did the first life come from? Atheists are so sure that everything evolved from simpler life forms, but they admittedly have no clue where these simpler life forms came from or where the information came from that kick-started the whole process. They just say it happened by chance. I'm sorry, I just can't accept that answer based on the order I see in the universe and the fact that we have so many different forms of life. And what is the chance that life could emerge by accident with no intelligence guiding it? To answer that question, we need to understand the complexity of cells and the proteins that build them and make them function properly. Because you have to believe that time and chance alone formed these complex cells with no intelligence guiding it. If Darwin's version of evolution is going to make life happen, it has to do it at the level of amino acids, proteins, and cells. And as we're about to see, this is highly unlikely. And to show just how unlikely it is that cells developed and evolved over time, we're going to do a thought experiment. We're going to see what it would take to build a cell, and then see if it's possible for these parts to organize on their own, assemble themselves, and then follow scientific laws with no intelligence guiding the process. The purpose of this experiment is to show how absurd the idea is that amino acids and proteins and replicating cells could form on their own. So let's imagine in this thought experiment that we go back in time before there was any life on the planet. There were no bacteria, there were no single-celled organisms, no nothing. Now we're going to sit and we're going to observe how long it takes for a replicating cell to form on its own. We're going to need all of the parts, obviously, so how many parts are we talking? Cells are not just microscopic blobs moving around aimlessly in our bodies. Now that scientists have powerful enough microscopes, way more powerful than anything in Darwin's day, we see a mini-universe inside cells and a level of complexity that boggles the mind. Franklin Herald wrote that cells come with artificial languages and their decoding systems, memory banks for information storage and retrieval, elegant control systems regulating the automated assembly of parts and components, error fail-safe and proofreading devices utilized for quality control, assembly processes involving the principle of prefabrication and modular construction, and a capacity not equaled in any of our own most advanced machines, for it would be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of hours. It would be crazy to think that we could just sit and watch a car make itself, but atheists actually believe that cells, which are far more complex, did just that. Cells are not just complex. That's just the beginning of it. They are what we call irreducibly complex. This means that every single part must work together, and if you remove just one of these parts, the whole system breaks down. It also means that it couldn't build itself over time through trial and error, or Darwinian evolution. If all the parts weren't working properly from the get-go, you don't have a functioning cell that means anything. If there was some early version of the cell that was missing a part or not put together just right, it could not pass this wrong information to a replicated cell, because it is broken to begin with and can't replicate. So evolution fails to explain how cells formed on their own over time. Evolution can only work if you have something already there that works, but it cannot explain origins, and that is the question we are after in this video. Now, in our thought experiment, as we wait for a cell to form on its own, we're probably going to see first amino acids organize, because amino acids form proteins, and proteins are what help build cells and help the cells operate. We aren't going to help the process, we're not going to cheat, and we're not going to dump a bunch of atoms into a pool of slime. We're simply going to observe and let time and chance create these complex molecules, since this is what had to happen according to an atheist. There was no one around to cheat, so we're not going to cheat either. How long will we have to sit and wait before one amino acid forms on its own? You may want to pop a lot of popcorn because we're going to be watching this movie for a very long time. The first problem we run into with this thought experiment is the fact that amino acids and proteins are made inside cells. So again, we're right back to where we started. You have to have a working cell first. We can't just sit and stare at a pool of slime and wait for an amino acid to form to build a protein. Even if we get lucky and a bolt of lightning strikes the pool of slime, we still won't see atoms bond in just the right way. It would be like throwing a grenade into a pool and then miraculously seeing all of the atoms form an amino acid. The point is, amino acids don't form on their own outside of the ribosome factories inside cells. The cell had to come first, and then the amino acids. This means that cells had to be working perfectly from the get-go. It could not have formed over time through the process of trial and error. In other words, it wasn't like a billion years goes by and the cell is experimenting with different configurations of amino acids until finally it gets it right and begins to replicate. But to give the atheist a fighting chance, we'll pretend that amino acids can form on their own outside of cells. Let's watch and wait and see it happen. So in order for us to witness the formation of an amino acid, we'd need at least 2 carbon atoms, at least 4 hydrogen atoms, 2 oxygen atoms, and 1 nitrogen atom to bond. This collection of atoms is in every amino acid, but depending on the amino acid, they have other atoms connected to them, so it gets even more complicated. But for this experiment, we're just going to wait for the basic ingredients that I just mentioned, and we're going to wait for them to bond. And remember, the atoms have to bond perfectly, like a puzzle, or the circuitry won't work. But here's why we're never going to see amino acids form spontaneously. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, you would need a volume of fluid the size of the observable universe for an amino acid to form spontaneously. Clearly, random molecular shuffling is of little use when the arrow of directionality points the wrong way. And by the way, as a side note, have you ever thought about how atoms even know how to bond? There are different types of bonds, covalent, ionic, etc. But these atoms are following specific laws programmed into them, and they follow these laws perfectly. Where did the law come from that governs chemical bonding? The fact that organic chemistry students can even study this law and talk about different types of bonds in their textbooks shows that some form of intelligence must have written it. The only other option is one that makes far less sense. Did all the atoms get together one day, hold a conference, and discuss how they're going to bond? The laws governing chemical bonds had to precede the chemicals themselves. So we're right back to information preceding matter and energy. In this picture of the amino acid, each letter represents an atom. Just imagine one day, billions of years ago, all of the atoms arranged themselves in the right order to form a molecule, and there was no intelligence guiding it. How did the two hydrogen atoms know to bond with the nitrogen atom? And then how did that molecule know how to bond to a carbon atom with a bonded hydrogen atom, and so on? After billions and billions of years of atoms all colliding, after countless hits and misses, after countless wrong configurations, they finally form an amino acid. Then what? Do the atoms all of a sudden become aware or switch on when an amino acid is formed? How do they know they are an amino acid and know what to do? Besides, we only have one amino acid, and we need at least 100 more to make just one protein. And even if we could watch one protein organize itself over billions of years, we are still light years away from a replicating cell. So how many more billions of years will it take for another miracle to occur where another amino acid forms? All right, so now let's talk about proteins. Once you have the amino acids, and there are many different kinds, you then need to link them up in just the right sequence so the proteins will take on the right shape. The probability that amino acids could form just one short functional protein with no intelligence guiding it is 1 chance in 10 to the 125th power. If you believe time and chance did this, then you are probably the most stubborn human being on the planet, because common sense alone tells you that is virtually impossible. There's just no way a functional protein could form on its own. Another thing to consider in this experiment, it's not enough just to have the right atoms, just like it isn't enough to have just the right parts to build a car. We need information added to our pool of amino acids to put all the parts together the right way. It just doesn't make sense that time and chance alone could account for this. The sequence of amino acids is not the same thing as the order seen in crystals or honeycombs. The order of amino acids is a language with instructional information. Think about the fact that if one part is off, the whole thing breaks down, which means it had to be working correctly from the beginning and could not, through trial and error, assemble itself. Some complex proteins in animals require 400 amino acids. That's not 400 atoms. Remember, an amino acid is a collection of different atoms, all bonded in just the right way. So we are talking about thousands of atoms all connected perfectly. Most people can't even imagine how computers are put together and how all the parts work in perfect harmony. But some actually believe something far more complex, like a protein, could assemble itself with no information guiding it. Proteins serve a specific purpose and actually do things. But they don't do things unless they are assembled correctly. This shows design. The protein's shape determines what its purpose and mission are. If the amino acids don't all connect in the right way, the protein will not be able to flex and bend to form the perfect shape it was designed for. But here's the question. How do the cells know how to arrange the amino acids in just the right way so they will take on the correct shape? We know now that the DNA holds the code for building proteins, but the code would have to be written before the proteins are formed. Think about that. If the cells assembled the proteins with no coding, how many times did the cells have to try to assemble the amino acids until the perfect combination was finally put together? And how did the cells even have the ability to do this without proteins, the very thing they're trying to assemble? So you see, the perfect combination of atoms had to be assembled the first time, and everything in the cell had to be working perfectly from the start, or you have no cell division. The cell can't work until all of its parts are in place. So we cannot come up with a wild theory that cells constructed themselves over eons of time through trial and error. If there had only been partly built cells with missing parts, those cells could never perform any function. and that includes replication, which would be necessary for genetic information to be passed on to the offspring. But you cannot have offspring without a fully functioning cell able to replicate. So the first cell had to be perfect, and that means the cell had to be perfectly built. And that means the cell had to have perfectly built parts or proteins at their creation. Cells cannot be the result of evolution. Now is where things get really interesting, because we're going to see how cells actually make amino acids and then proteins. It all happens because of DNA in the nucleus of the cell. DNA is a very complex information and language system, and it's actually the most efficient processing system in the universe. About 100,000 chemical reactions take place in the cell per second, and it all happens because of DNA, which has about the same amount of information that you'd find in the Encyclopedia Britannica. The DNA molecule is just a medium to carry the information of life. The molecules themselves are not alive. Just like words printed in a book aren't the actual story. But for the story in the author's head to get into your head, he or she has to put the information onto a medium so it can pass from the author to the reader. The immaterial information in the molecules comes from the mind of an author, God. But something has to read the information. Information is one thing, but you have to be able to understand the language for it to do any good. There is language in DNA, and the cells know how to read it. To understand how the information in the DNA is transferred, think of how symbols in language take information from one form and change it into another. In Morse code, for example, you can use sounds or symbols. As long as you know how to read the code, you can translate the sounds and symbols into letters of the alphabet. Music is another great example. The sounds needed to make music are represented on paper as musical notation. But those ink strokes on the page are not the actual music. The players have to read the language of music and then make their instrument or voice follow the rules of that language. The music says play an A and the clarinet plays a B, well, that's not the right note. If a musician sees a whole note on the staff, they know how to hold the sound for 4 beats. If they see that the note on the staff has a little flag attached to it, then they know that's an eighth note. They know how much value the note has. It's a language. It's a code. All of that information is packed into the symbols of the musical language. The whole note is a code. The eighth note is a code, and it tells the musician how to communicate it in the material world. When it comes to DNA, there are molecules in the DNA that carry a line of code that must be translated. Just like every language has so many letters in their alphabet, think of the language of life as only having 4 letters. But in this case, they're actually molecules. And these molecules are what make up the rung of the ladder in the twisted DNA. If you've ever seen a DNA strand, how it's like a twisted ladder. Well, the rungs of that ladder are these molecules. And scientists use the letters A, G, C, T, and each letter represents a molecule with a name starting with the letter. Adenine, for example, is an A. And just like letters in a specific order can communicate information, so too can the rungs of the ladder in the DNA. The way these rungs are ordered is the code. But how this code is read and then used to make proteins is astounding. And here's how it works. There is an amazing piece of nanotechnology in the cell called an RNA polymerase. This thing travels down the DNA strand like a zipper and unwinds it so it can be copied. The copy, which is called RNA, leaves the nucleus through a pore and travels to another factory within the cell that reads it, called a ribosome. The ribosome factory reads the chemical bases that were copied from the original DNA strand, and then it takes the floating amino acids nearby and starts building proteins by arranging these amino acids. The ribosome knows exactly which amino acids to string together and what order based on the sequence of bases copied in the RNA. That's language. When the protein leaves the ribosome factory, it is then accompanied by other molecules that keep it safe as it makes its way to another machine that makes the link of atoms fold in just the right way. Once the protein is complete, it is released into the cytoplasm to perform a specific operation. Now, this is basically the same technology used in factories all around the world that assemble things. A computer programmer will write a program, which is basically a bunch of commands and instructions written in a code the computer can use. Then the machine will follow the instructions in the computer code to make whatever it's designed to make. No one in their right mind would think a Ford assembly plant that uses computer programs to build car parts wrote its own code and then started making the parts on their own. It's even more true for proteins. So the obvious question at this point is, where did this genetic code come from in DNA? Scientists have never once seen matter create one bit of code. Information never emerges from matter. Matter emerges from information. So mind must have set all of this in motion. Here's something else absolutely amazing that screams that there is a creator. We have all kinds of different types of cells in our body. Nerve cells don't look like or operate like blood cells. And skin cells don't look like and need the same proteins as cells in the bones. But each cell in the body, regardless of type, has the same DNA in it. So not only does each cell have to have information, the cell needs a language and way of regulating which proteins will be assembled. This shows a level of forethought and ingenuity that simply cannot be created by time and chance alone. Now let me give you some interesting facts about DNA that will blow your mind. One DNA molecule is called a chromosome, and I'm sure you've heard of chromosomes. And if you think about it like a book, each of our 46 chromosomes would be like a single chapter in the book of life. This book of life that is in the nucleus of each of our cells is made up of 46 chapters, or 46 chromosomes. And each of these has between 48 to 250 million letters. That's 3.2 billion letters in one human gene. Just one chapter would equal 75,490 pages of the New York Times. Think about that. Each of these 46 chromosomes contains millions of genes. And these genes give instructions to your cells to tell them how to build your body and what operations to perform. Your genes tell your eyes what size, shape, and color to be. Your genes have the instructions to tell your skin cells, your hair cells, and every single part of your body what to do. Think about it. Why is it that some have proteins to paint their eyes blue while others have brown eyes? And how could time and chance do this? Now here's something else to think about. If you unwind one DNA molecule, it would be 6 feet long. Think about how God crammed 6 feet worth of matter into such a tiny amount of space, so small that we can't even see it without a microscope. One cell is so small that you can line 200 of them up side by side and it would fill the dot and the letter I typed on a piece of paper. Just the little dot. And to think something that small has 100 million proteins in it doing something. It just boggles the mind how active cells are and all that goes on in them. And they are smaller than any machines man has ever created. Now think of this. If each chromosome can unwind to 6 feet, and if we take the 46 chromosomes in each of the 50 trillion cells in our body, it would stretch from the Earth to the Moon 5 million round trips. That is staggering to think about. It's almost impossible to think that we have enough matter in us to even do that. Humans are so tiny compared to the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Yet we are made of things so tightly packed together that if you let it all unwind, we'd fill the whole solar system. But here's what's amazing. If you take the wound up DNA from all of the cells in your body, it would only fill up 2 tablespoons. Think about that. God crammed enough matter to go back and forth between the Earth and Moon 5 million times into 2 tablespoons of volume. How anyone can believe that happened by chance alone is a mystery to me. Here's another interesting fact. If we could take just one chromosome from every person on the planet, it would be about the size of an aspirin. So that means we could have all of the information to make every person on the planet and something the size of a pill. God is amazing. To give you an idea of just how genius God is, consider the rate at which cells divide from the point of conception. A fertilized egg has 46 chromosomes, 23 from the mother and 23 from the father. Now you know these chromosomes are complex molecules, all assembled in just the right way. We talked about that earlier. Imagine a cell dividing and having to assemble the atoms again to make a duplicate. Every minute, from the point the sperm fertilizes the egg, 15,000 cells with all of their perfectly functioning proteins are made. This goes on for 9 months, and each of these cells is far more complicated than a space shuttle. Imagine working in a factory that made 15,000 space shuttles per minute. Imagine having to provide the materials and supplies to make the shuttles and the manpower to do it, and none of these men could ever take a break. It would never happen. Yet something more complex than manufacturing space shuttles takes place in the womb for 9 months. That's how powerful our God is. So what can we make of all of this? The only logical conclusion we can come to, and still maintain intellectual integrity, is that a creator must have created life. Atheists keep holding out for a purely naturalistic explanation for how information is directing the activity in cells. This is blind faith. They refuse to see what's right in front of them and have no alternative explanation for how life emerged from non-living properties. We can conclude from what we know so far that life, at least, shows signs that a mind must have come up with it. Chemical evolution without some form of intelligence is impossible. The amount of information that is running every biological process cannot emerge out of a void. Only a mind makes sense here. A mind so intelligent that we could never begin to fathom it. The only thing that fits this description is God. And the Bible says that God is life. Not that he has life, but he is life. God has life in and of himself. It's called his aseity, as we'll talk about in some other video. But God is alive because of who he is. He's not alive because someone gave him life. He is the author of life, and all life that we see on this planet comes from him. He is the source of the information that's running all of it. So just think about how amazing he is. Think about his mind, how incredibly intelligent this God is. It's just amazing to think about. It'll make your brain hurt, that's for sure. But anyway, I hope you got something out of this video. I hope it strengthens your faith, and I hope you see that at the end of the day, the only thing that makes sense is there must be an intelligent creator.